So again, thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Colonias Investment Areas, Texas. We've got a few participants on the line. Some of you are familiar, some of you are not. Just a little PSA on Housing Assistance Council. For those of you that are not familiar with the Housing Assistance Council, HAC is a national nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that seeks to strengthen rural communities across America through investment and assistance with affordable housing and community and economic development activities that advance rural prosperity. With a mission to improve housing conditions for the rural poor, HAC places an emphasis on striving to serve the poorest of the poor in the most rural places. So if you're interested in learning more about HAC services or products, or if you have questions or require assistance, please contact us directly by phone or email. The contact information for our national office, as well as our regional locations, are currently being displayed on the screen. So at this point, I'd like to quickly introduce our speakers as well as the Fannie Mae staff that are joining us on the call today. First up is Kelly Coffey, the Product Manager, Duty to Serve Initiatives in Rural Housing. Kelly is responsible for the management and strategic development of Fannie Mae's single-family rural housing initiatives, as well as the leadership and execution of its underserved market plans under the Duty to Serve Final Rule. Her work includes serving rural markets, underserved populations, and housing innovation. Our next speaker from the HAC team is Lance George, the Director of Research and Information. Lance is the Director of Research and Information at the Housing Assistance Council, where he oversees HAC's research and policy analysis, which encompasses a wide array of issues and topics related to affordable housing, including manufactured housing, poverty and high-need rural areas, rural definitions and classifications, mortgage access and finance, and general demography, mapping, and data analysis of rural people and their housing conditions. The next speaker joining us from the Fannie Mae's team is Sam Lipschitz. He is the Product Development Manager, Multifamily Affordable Initiatives. Sam manages the strategy and execution of various affordable housing initiatives in the multifamily rental space, especially projects focused on serving the needs of rural communities. Sam's work also includes strategies for addressing the challenges in workforce housing, the preservation of existing affordable rental housing, and support for environmental sustainability. And coming to our last speaker for today's webinar is Keith Wiley. Keith is a Senior Research Associate here at the Housing Assistance Council, where he's intently focused on rural housing and development, smart growth planning and policies, as well as environmental economics. As part of his work, Keith works extensively with many data sets, HMDA, ACS, Census data, etc., to better understand where, when, and how development patterns occur. And so with that introduction done, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Lance.
Thank you, Shantaria. And I'd like to send a warm welcome to everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'd like to also thank our colleagues, our partners at Fannie Mae who are joining us in this call today, and generally for their support of this important work. And I'd really, most importantly, like to thank all of you who joined us on the line. We were somewhat intentional about who we invited to this, experts who knew this subject matter very well. We're really looking forward in this call today for your feedback, either today or in the future, on this concept. We think it's relatively, or we know it's relatively new, but you are the actual experts. Keith and I and our team, we kind of sit in a Washington, D.C. office, even though we have a great field presence in the American Southwest. But we largely sit here and have done this with the computers and kind of worked with local regional partners. But we're really looking for your insights and your knowledge on this particular issue to help us inform and advance this concept and this issue, quite frankly. As many of you know, the Housing Assistance Council has been engaged in helping rural communities, and particularly what we would classify as high-need rural communities, since our inception in 1971. And the Colonias is no exception. We have a kind of a long history of working in that communities, and we're particularly excited to bring some of our work to you on this particular issue today. But I will say it's probably a little different than what some of you are accustomed to, or even what we've done largely at HAC in the Colonia realm. And And some of this, I'll be candid, largely this discussion today is initially about definitions and geography. And I know that's not probably the hottest topic and maybe not what you initially thought of or what you think of with this particular issue. But at the end of the day, it's not about definitions and geography. It's really about getting targeted resources or better targeting resources and ease of access to those resources to communities that need it most. And that's going to be what we're talking about today. So some of it can be a little technical, and we're trying to talk about some definitional issues, but at the end of the discussion, what we're really talking about is a more efficient delivery system of mortgage finance resources to Colonia communities. So please keep that in mind. I think that's our ultimate goal. But bear with us while we go through some of the technical elements. As I noted before, we really intentionally kind of chose this audience. So many of you know much more about Colonias than most of us speaking today, quite frankly, but we really want your insights. So most of you know some of the core concepts of what Colonia communities are. We're going to be talking a little more today about definitional issues. I'm going to give a brief introduction and then turn it over to our lead researcher, Dr. Keith Wiley, who's done with his team has done a lot of work on this. But most of you know some of the genesis of Colonias and the elements that comprise the Colonias. It can be somewhat complicated and it varies a lot by geography and region. But really, these communities are often defined by what they lack, oftentimes in infrastructure needs and various socioeconomic resources and elements. And quite frankly, these are some of the poorer communities in the United States, and they undeniably lack mortgage access, which is what we're focused on with this discussion today. We initially talked about some of the definitional issues, and I just wanted to show this graphic to start out with. We're going to get a little more detail, but this is the traditional definition, and there are many definitions of Colonia community, but one of the more frequently used is the Cranston-Gonzalez definition, which is 150 miles north of the U.S.-Mexico border, and it just follows the border. And you can see it illustrated here. It's the kind of 150 miles north. And we're really focusing today on Texas. And I just want to really hammer home this discussion. We've had these discussions, or hammer home this point. We've had these discussions in all in most of the Colonia border states. And most of our research has indicated that we are purposefully coming to you in each individual state because there's a lot of variation within Colonia communities by state. That's one of the main things that we found. There are a lot of unifying and common characteristics, but at the same time, we found a lot of variation by state. So we wanted to purposefully have these listening sessions in each state to kind of get that perspective. So I know there are people on the line from other states, but we're really focusing on Texas today. Although we welcome comments from any area, but that's where most of the analysis and most of the references coming from. So we are doing the entire border region, but today we are focusing on Texas. Texas arguably is probably, at least in influence as the large state, probably definitely has the most number of colonias, the largest number of colonias. I mean, it's very important in this discussion. So we're very much looking forward to this element or your input in this discussion. Before we get started today in some of the definitional issues and the concept itself, we would just like to ask an informal question to everyone. There's a kind of an interactive poll that you can take that we would like you to participate on. Do you have trouble or confusion identifying, defining Colonia communities for programs or resources? And it's either kind of yes or no or don't know. And we'll give you a few minutes because we did want to just get a sense of where you're kind of falling on that element. So we at least the feedback we are getting that most of you kind of don't have trouble or confusion, and that might be an element of being in Texas, which maybe have some more defined work and has worked on this issue maybe more some of the other states. But if I'm reading those polls correctly, Terry, that's what the initial is, that most people don't have trouble or confusion identifying Colonia communities for their programs or resources. So that's an interesting observation. We'll move on into the concept of why we are revisiting this today, and just generally introducing the concept of a Colonias investment area and how we got there. So why are we looking at this today? And I think there are a couple of reasons, but one of which has related to particularly the duty to serve initiative. And we can go into more detail in the duty to serve in the question and answer. But as many of you know, it's a more intentional focus on expanding mortgage access in various high-need rural communities. There are various aspects of this that relate to manufactured housing and housing preservation, but there's also a rural component of duty to serve, which basically mandates that Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac have a more targeted component to providing access and mortgage liquidity in certain high-need communities that have not been served by those resources before. Within the course of that, when they identify these high-need communities, these high-need rural communities, most of them have been very well defined, have been very specifically defined. But the Colonias area was actually somewhat, I wouldn't say it was vague, but it was much more general in that description. It didn't provide the specificity that the other areas did, and they somewhat left it up to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac to define that, or to define that themselves, not to define it, but to identify the communities. It basically says that an identifiable community, a colonia, is an identifiable community that meets the definition of a colonia under a federal, state, or local program. So they didn't provide a list like they did in many of the other areas. Therefore, we've been working with Fannie Mae to help them better identify and understand these communities, at least from a geographic perspective. And I would say under this component of, or this element of the Colonia Investment Area concept, we really, at the end of the day, and I'll kind of just tell you initially, it basically comes down to defining it as census tracts. And we'll get to how we got there and why we got there. But there are several main reasons why it's basically based at that element. The first element, the first component is that there are basically three main technical elements, and I would say there's one more adaptive element to the definition, and the first of which is there are some elements that are related to this in the technical component.
Lance, are you okay?
Yes, I get they can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you fine.
Okay, all right. So basically, we want there are three major elements here. I'm sorry, I thought we were having some technical difficulties there. But there are three major elements within the kind of the concept that we wanted to advance. The first of which is the component of a census tract, and that is consistent with a lot of the other duty to serve requirements, quite frankly. So there's a consistency there. The second element that we largely settled on census tracts was the component that it's the lowest level of geography where we can analyze the market and or evaluate the market. So if you go below that level of geography, and this is getting slightly technical, you really don't know much. You can't get much information, particularly around the use or the access to mortgage credit. So in one way, we can better understand the market with that, and then the other way, we can also evaluate better what is some of the activity and how this is working in the market, or how access is working in the market. And then finally, I would say the major, it's a more conceptual element of the Colonia Investment Areas, was the component of, this is a different commodity, access to mortgage credit, than maybe some other elements that we're thinking about in Colonia communities, maybe access to water or electricity or infrastructure services. So this is an important component, and in some respects, there are some technical elements that might preclude, those services being located in particular Colonia communities. So the broader concept of a census tract might work better for the component of a larger investment area, as opposed to specific targeting within Colonia communities. and we can discuss that further as well. So I want to briefly, before we turn it over to Keith, just present some of the components of how we identified or how we developed the Colonia Investment Areas. The first of which is identification. There are four major components to how we identify the Colonia Investment Area, and the first is just simply identifying the colonia. So we identified a list of publicly recognized colonia which are located in the statute or in the rule, in the regulation. And some of the more commonly used identifiers are from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, USDA and EPA, states, and local municipalities. And just to give you an example, these are links to some of the major data sources that we use to compile this. Now, this is a relatively general recitation of a relatively complicated process, I'll have to say. But initially, we had to identify lists. And this is just a graphic illustration of the number of colonia that we identified from those lists to ultimately find 2,190 colonia, unique colonia that we identified through this process. And this is just an example of the list and some of the process that we identified. But the second major component of this is to locate the colonia. And there's a major distinction here. You might say, well, what's the difference between identifying and locating them? And to give an example, some colonia communities might just show up on a list. For example, Chula Vista Colonia in Zavala County, Texas, right? And that's all you have. To identify them, to locate that's only to identify. And sometimes they are just on a list with no geographic or locational data. So to locate them, we actually had to find what we would call geocode them or have some geo address through points and polygons or underlying geography, where we could actually plot them on a map so we know where the investment areas are. And this can get somewhat technical. This is some GIS terminology on points and polygons. But basically, we identified first, then we had to take notes and identify them. And some of them, quite frankly, were not identifiable. This is a graphic illustration. It just shows some of the communities, the colonia communities that we identified in McAllen, Texas. So the red areas are identified colonia, and that's a good example of a polygon. So these red areas, those are the colonia that we identified in this process. The third major component of this is what we would call aggregation. And this is where we aggregate up to the actual Colonia Investment Area to census tracts, as I mentioned before. So first we identified the actual colonia. Then we put those in census blocks. What census block are they in? And then we identified the census tract from there. What census tract are they in? So it's really an aggregation up from a small level of geography, a very small level of geography, to the census tract, where again it had those advantages we noted before on being able to evaluate and assess and better understand the market because you have more data at that level of geography. And this is just an illustration again of the census blocks. This is a smaller geography, the census blocks within colonia communities, and the purple line is the old traditional 150 miles of the north of the U.S.-Mexico border. And the next distillation is, quite frankly, just census. These are the census tracts. The orange areas, the lighter orange areas, show the census tracts that include a colonia, that have a colonia community. And at the end of the day, those are what we are calling Colonia Investment Areas. And again, you'll see the distinction between the lighter orange areas and the purple line, which is the traditional 150-mile area for Colonia Investment Areas. I mean, for basically defining a colonia border region. And in some respects, I think this is not a research term. This is probably a Lance term. We are basically looking at the Goldilocks scenario here, where it's not too warm, not too cold, but somewhere in the middle, where you're actually identifying and targeting mortgage resources to communities that have colonia located within them. And then finally, this is where we kind of stripped out the other small levels of geography. And at the end of the process, these are the actually these are the actual Colonia communities, Colonia investment areas that we identified in this process within Texas. So these are basically census tracts that have a Colonia community in them. And that is, in essence, the definition of a Colonia investment area. That was a relatively simple recitation of how we got there. There was a lot of work, kind of a lot of tedium and a lot of work and a lot of ground truthing to find and make sure that these communities were in these areas. And quite frankly, as many of you know, there's not a lot of good information on Colonia communities. And so kind of identifying and quantifying and quality control checking that was a large component of this process. And then finally, the compilation of the data. So at the end of the day, I noted before that we had four major areas, or the four major states, but at the end of the day, we actually identified all four of those. We combined all four of these processes into one large macro database. So we do believe it's important to do this. We did this at each state individually, but then we combined them, all four of them, and added some data enhancements and normalized across the data sets to build one large master database of Colonia investment areas.
Hello?
And then finally, so this just gives you a general recitation of the distribution of the census tracts. So you'll notice here that we identified at the end of the day in Texas 271 census tracts, or in other parlance, these would be 271 Colonia investment areas with a population of about 1.6 million. And then finally, this is just another geographic or another illustration of those Colonia investment areas by the number of Colonia in the community. So the darker shade of these Colonia investment areas, which would be these census tracts, indicate a greater number of Colonia. And some of these census tracts, as you know, in southern Texas are very small, so they don't really show well on this map. But the darker the color of the map, or the darker the color of the census tract, indicates that a larger number of Colonia in those communities. So at this juncture, that's just the concept itself.
It's not doing it.
And presenting the concept itself. At this point, I think we might try to turn to Dr. Wiley to present the preliminary analysis.
I got nothing. I don't know what you want me to do.
Okay, so it sounds like Keith is unable to join us, so I'll probably advance that component of the presentation and work on the preliminary analysis. These are some of the analyses that we conducted on the Colonia investment. And first we just looked at basic demographic characteristics. And we did that by, the Colonia investment area, the border region as a whole, and then Texas. And you'll see that there's not a lot of surprising indicators here. First of which is that you have a large Hispanic or Latino population. And it is a pretty significant component of the population in Texas, quite frankly, and that you have very high levels of poverty, particularly in the Colonia investment area, almost twice the national rate, or more than twice the national rate, at about 30%. You also have, and then we looked at some basic selected housing characteristics, the first of which was you have relatively high home ownership rate in Colonia investment areas, much higher than in levels, the other levels that we compared. Also, another key characteristic, and we found this in almost all of the states, a relatively high level of manufactured housing, which is an important source of housing in rural areas, but particularly in Colonia investment areas. And this is, as many of you know, manufactured housing can be a complicated issue. It's an extremely important resource in many of these communities, but some of the peripheral elements related to manufactured housing, how it's financed, sold, warranted, and appraised, are not as beneficial to consumers, particularly how those elements are used in these areas. And that really is an important component of the housing characteristics. And again, these are some very preliminary characteristics. Once we identified all of the Colonia investment areas, we did a very basic demographic and kind of social and housing analysis, We hope to expand that work, but these are some very general or some very basic analyses. So we also looked particularly at mortgage lending activity because that's the primary variable that we're looking here. The primary scope of the Colonia Investment Areas, the crux or the impetus is to help expand and better target mortgage resources in those communities. So we really looked at some of the more recent Home Mortgage Disclosure Act lending data in these areas. And we compared those to outside of Colonia Investment Areas on some basic general characteristics. And I think some of the general findings from that are, there are the mortgage activity here is relatively small, at least for the reporters in the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act, right? So you had a relatively small number of all of the mortgage activity in these areas was done in Colonia Investment Areas. And these were loans per 1,000 owner-occupied units. So you see a relatively low amount of mortgage activity if you control across those areas. And it's even much lower in the rural elements, in the extreme rural areas or the actual rural areas of the Colonia Investment Areas. And this is probably a good opportunity to note that the Colonia Investment Areas, as we have defined here, are both in urban and rural areas within this geography. And as you know, many of the Colonia in Texas are located in metropolitan or oftentimes more rural locales. But for the most part, you see much lower mortgage activity in these areas. To some degree, we don't know if we're entirely picking up all of the finance activity and all of the mortgage activity because we think some of it might not be captured in these data sources. And we're trying to advance that work on what is the actual mortgage activity, the mortgage resources in these communities. But from a general perspective, there is a lot less mortgage activity in these areas, which is just the opposite of what it should be if you looked at some of the demographics, some of the age characteristics, and some of the demographic characteristics in the area. And then, basically, this is another way to look at this, that it actually just reconfirms what that's saying before, that you actually have even much lower mortgage activity rates. And I'm going to have to, I think Dr. Wiley is having some technical problems and is not able to come in today on our webcast, but this is the issue where you see that this analysis reconfirms that you have lower mortgage activity in those areas. And that you have a large, and this is again not a surprise to anyone given the demographic characteristics, but you do have a high ratio of Hispanic and Latino lending in these communities. But this is an element where, again, you can see where it is much higher in this area, in this community, and that's not really a surprise, quite frankly. But you see the originations are lower for Hispanics in these areas. So that is when you compare it to the number to the population, the originations are actually lower. And again, to reiterate another point that we talked about before, a large level of manufactured home lending in many of these communities. This is a major resource for various reasons. And you can see it's much higher than the national rate and even the Texas rate, particularly in what we would classify as the manufactured home communities. I'm sorry, in the Colonia Investment Areas. So again, this housing resource is much more important in those areas. And finally, and I think this is somewhat related to, not finally, but I think this is somewhat related to that element of manufactured housing. You have a relatively high level of what we would call high cost loans, where borrowers are paying significantly above the prime rate. And you'll notice this is evident in Colonia Investment Areas, which would point to the need for greater financial access and better quality housing finance in these areas. So you'll note that it's much higher nationally, almost 21%. That's more than twice the national rate of high cost loans, and some of that is driven by manufactured housing. There's a very high level of high cost lending in manufactured home communities. And this just shows you the origination by the loans by the type of loan, whether the conventional loan, FHA, VA, or a USDA loan. And you'll note here that you do have some less conventional lending in the border region and the Colonia Investment Areas, and you do have a higher rate of FHA, VA, and USDA loans in those areas. And they are more rural areas, but you do notice that you have less market presence by conventional lenders in that market space. We're going to close out here. We really wanted to leave a lot of time, and I know we had some technical difficulties, so I don't think our research team could come in on this as much as we like, but what we really wanted to do was open this space up and have you kind of comment on the concept either now or in the near future, but also we really want to take this time to get some feedback. We do have a closing poll question where do Colonia Investment Areas adequately capture the locations where colonias exist in Texas? And I know this is a relatively early, we're just presenting you with the concept, but looking at the overall element, do you think that it adequately captures that? And like I say, we would like your initial feedback, but also some other feedback that you might have if you're able to kind of study this more and let it sink in. So we know this is relatively early in the process, but it does sound like some people at least garner this element or kind of understand this element of what the process is. And we understand that there are a few people kind of voting that they don't know, and we fully understand this is a relatively new concept. We'll be presenting more on this and hopefully presenting this in more at more public venues and also in writing. So at this point, I think we'd really like to just open up the conversation and see if people had questions. We know this is a relatively new concept, and we just really, there was a lot of work. I'll have to give a lot of credit to Hack's research team. There was a lot of work, kind of endless hours of computer of geographic analysis and data analysis, and kind of ground checking and controlling and talking with representatives in the region and scanning over maps to get the best quality analysis that we could to identify these areas. But we really want to turn it over to you now, either today or in general, to get any feedback or any comments or any questions that you might have about the concept of Colonia Investment Areas.
Thank you, Lance. I did want to first, before jumping into the questions, acknowledge the comments from Ann Cass and their desire to have the definition redefined to broaden their funding sources. And I pushed that comment along to Lance, who will share it with the Fannie staff. But I wanted to acknowledge that before we move off into the questions. So thank you very much, Ann. The first question that we have up in the queue today is, do you account for colonias that are no longer recognized as colonias?
I think this is a kind of a critical juncture. Most of the colonias, and I think that's an element that we took into with the mandate of the regulation. So if it does not appear on a publicly identifiable designation or a list, we did not analyze it. We know this is an issue that's in flux and that communities kind of come and go, but under this particular project, we were kind of confined to the mandate of any identifiable colonia. So if it is not on one of those publicly identified lists, it is not identified under the colonia concept area. Now, I would say that because we go to the slightly larger geography of a census tract, there is probably a high likelihood that there's a colonia in those areas, quite frankly. I think I wouldn't call it a safety net, but I think it's one of the advantages of this concept that we're really looking to identify and target resources to communities that actually do have colonia, and we didn't find colonia outside of these. And there's a likelihood maybe if a colonia is not identified, that it's probably likely to be located in this general geographic area.
All right. Second question that's up in the queue is, are there colonias beyond the 150-mile U.S.-Mexico border area?
I think this is another great question, and I think it somewhat relates to the last question. I think this issue or this theory differs among scholars. In this approach, we're really looking only at areas probably within the border region, within the 150 miles. But there are some arguments and some discussion and some justifiable research and analysis that there are colonia community that do exist even outside of the border region, possibly in areas of California or in the American Southeast. But for this analysis, we didn't include those. We want to advance our research with some of the learning that we've had here to investigate what we would call the new colonia. And some of those would be colonia that are occurring in Texas that are not on these lists, Texas in the American Southwest, but also some areas that are located far from the American Southwest or far from the Mexican border, U.S.-Mexico border region. But for this particular Colonias investment, really only include those communities on the U.S.-Mexico border.
Thank you. An additional question. We have 2 questions remaining in the queue. For those of you that are thinking of questions, please be sure and enter them in the Q&A box that appears on the lower right-hand side of your screen. The next question, are colonias in Texas the same as colonia in Arizona, California, and New Mexico?
In some ways, I would say no, definitely no. That's the one of the major findings that we found out of this analysis and a lot of the preliminary analysis that we conducted. I mean, I think many of the representatives in those areas or the experts in those areas would acknowledge there was a lot of variation both on geography, social, economic, cultural issues, but particularly what we were interested here, the geography in those areas by state. So there's a lot of variation. And that's why our methodology was to look at each state independently and then analyze those together, ultimately to try to normalize as much as we can. But we found it very important to look at those states individually. There's, again, a lot of variation by geography, and that was a key component of our methodology. So yes, there are vast differences that we found, but to the best of our ability, for programmatic reasons and policy reasons, we also needed to kind of collapse them into one larger group. So to the best of our ability, within this Colonia Investment Area concept, we collapse them into one larger data set with the acknowledgement that they are very different by state. And I think under that rubric or under that general methodology of is a colonia located in a census tract, it does permit or allow that concept to some degree. So I think, Shantari, the question is yes and no, but mostly yes, there are a lot of differences, but we did try to account for that and normalize across. But our data, our analysis really was at the core of that component, was to honor and recognize that there are a lot of differences and not to treat this as one homogeneous group, which we've seen in other analyses. So we did place a focus on states, individual states, and that's why we're coming to you just today in Texas.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Lance. And thank you, Lee, for populating the question here after that last appeal. So Lee has a question. Have you taken the identified colonias through this process and added them as census designated places for the census participant statistical area program?
We have not at this juncture. We are aware of some of those processes, but we are not using the census designated place. We were using primarily the census tract, and we noted for a couple of reasons the relevance to this particular federal initiative and regulation. We are somewhat aware of that, but we're using a different level of geography. And there are, like I've often said, there are advantages and disadvantages to different geographies. There are advantages to using the place, which would be a city or a town or what's called a census designated place. But there are disadvantages, particularly in states like Texas, where you have various annexation laws. So again, there's no perfect definition, but our process is that we've looked at primarily census tracts.
All right, perfect. Thank you. That was the last question. Oh, I'm sorry.
Terry, I would just only add, I'm sorry, I would only add that we would love to hear more about that, Lee, from your perspective, and take that into consideration. So we would like to further that discussion if you have any questions or any insights, but we have not looked at it from that angle. We looked at it from a lot of different geographies, but not the census designated place in any large scale fashion.
All right, thank you, Lance. I apologize for that last interruption. Wanted to quickly make one final appeal to see if there are any of you out on the line that have burning questions or questions that may be percolating right now for Lance. We'll give you another few seconds before we move to close then.
Terry,
Right.
Terry, in closing, I would just like to say, again, we understand this is a relatively new concept, and we really want to reiterate that we want to hear your perspective and your feedback. So we thank you for joining us today and taking time to listen to this concept and better understand the concept. But we would love to get any feedback and any perspective or any insights that you might have. Again, we know that you work in these communities, are much more familiar with them, and much more familiar with the processes. So we understand that's maybe a lot of information to consume, and it's relatively new information to consume. But don't hesitate to contact us. This is an iterative process, and we really need it to better inform the concept itself.
Perfect, thank you. And I'll just follow up on Lance's comment to say you are able to submit that feedback directly following the webinar. You will receive an evaluation via email. Please take an opportunity to review and complete that evaluation, and also provide us with information and feedback as part of your comments. And so with that being said, I'd like to thank Lance for his wealth of information shared. I'd like to thank the Fannie staff for their participation in joining us on the call today, and each of you for your time in being with us today. So thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your afternoon.